Welcome to Hollywood Insider Help, where you can learn more about how to earn a good living as an author, screenwriter, producer, or podcaster. Remember, you can find great live and on-demand training designed to help you earn a good living making media you love at nancyfultonmeetups.com and nfm24.com. Our host is Nancy Fulton. Let's dive in.
Today's event, we're going to be talking about significant Hollywood disasters and important lessons learned. And our specific objective is going to be learning why some projects fail and how other projects succeed. I think this is a particularly important workshop because many of the topics that we'll be discussing, many of the films that we'll be discussing are legend in Hollywood. I think people, when they first come to Hollywood, they're trying to sell their projects, whether it's their screenplays or they're working on set and they're trying to improve the film that's being produced. They encounter behavior that they don't understand. They can't figure out why people are so touchy about their little area of expertise, and they don't understand why filmmakers are so rigid about certain kinds of screenplays and certain kinds of situations that develop. By the time you get done with this workshop, I think you'll understand a lot of those kinds of behavior, because many of these projects were actually what created a lot of the rules that we live under here in the entertainment industry. I think you'll be shocked at how many of the strange behaviors we have here and don't appear to be really anywhere else in the world, how they came about from these particular films. They really are legend. So one of the best ways to learn how to make movies is to take a look at how movies have been made and to look at the surprise successes and the surprise disasters. It helps you know what you have to get right as a producer or a director or a writer or performer. What's surprising is how many times what could have been a great film has become a true disaster for people financially, personally, and professionally. And specifically, when you have a whole bunch of people working together on a film, what's interesting is that some people can be huge winners and other people can be huge failures. You can have a great diversity in terms of how people are served by a particular project. Sometimes the producer's the big winner, sometimes the producer's the big loser, sometimes the writer's the big winner, sometimes the writer's the big loser. But in this workshop, we're going to really be focusing on projects that went really badly, who they went badly for, who they probably didn't go so badly for, who was really lucky to be participating in the disaster, so to speak. And we'll be talking about life-changing wins and life-destroying losses created a lot of times by the same film. There are patterns that are to be found in success and failure. And looking at these legendary films, it's easy to find and remember them. The other thing I'd mention is that in Hollywood, films I'm going to be talking about have influenced behavior for a very long time. And so by knowing these stories, it's like you're in on the joke. It also means that when you have to convince somebody of something, let's say you're working with a producer on a co-producer on a particular project or a co-writer on a particular project, and you're trying to convince them that a certain problem is a situation that has to be addressed or that people are moving into dangerous territory. When you can point to one of these projects or some of the other 70 or more huge failures that are well recognized in the entertainment industry, when you can point to them and you can say, look, this is just like this, you'd be shocked at how much more effective you are at making your case. When you say something's your opinion, they may or may not listen. But when you can say, look, if you look at these 5 shows, when this pattern of behavior happened, it translated into this, and here's why. Somehow or other, it tends to be more persuasive and more convincing than just you saying something's not right here. As we dive into this workshop, I do want to mention that I'm going to be expressing my opinion about these particular projects, give you an opportunity to do your own research and make your own decision about the particular events that I'm talking about. None of the information I'm talking about here should be construed as like legal advice or financial advice for any particular project, because I'm talking about the industry as a whole and the rules that govern the industry as a whole, as opposed to something that's related to any particular individual film you might be specifically working on. We have some films that are like fairly large budget, like huge budgets, and some that are little independent films. Since I cater to producers, authors, screenwriters, actors, and those selling expertise, I have to say that a project that just generates money or good reviews isn't always really a success. Sometimes a project that makes money actually turns out to be a failure for the people that worked on it. And also, sometimes a film can make money for some people and leave other people with tremendous collateral damage in terms of burned out careers, really badly damaged reputations, serious health problems, etc., deaths occasionally. So sometimes one author, writer, producer, or actor will win and the rest will lose big. Sometimes everybody loses. As we run through these projects, I think it's important to pay attention to which role you might be playing in each particular project, and that you think about the stresses and the risks and the costs that would have applied to you in that particular project. Because that goes toward you thinking about what you want your career in the entertainment industry to be about. In the entertainment industry, especially right now, you have an infinite number of options when it comes to defining your career. You decide what films you're going to work on. You decide what kinds of projects you're going to take. If you're a producer, you decide what kind of projects you're going to make. If you're a screenwriter, you figure out what kind of project you want to write. If you're an actor, you figure out where you want to build your long-term success. So the more you know about the entertainment industry and about different kinds of projects and the kinds of trauma and great success that can come from different kinds of projects, the easier it is for you to chart what you want to have happen when it comes to your particular life and your particular art. So with that in mind, I think I just want to dive into the first film. It's an oldie but a goodie. So Cleopatra, very famous film. I'm sure you've watched it. I think it's some ridiculous length, like around 3 hours. Cleopatra premiered in June of 1963. It became the highest grossing film of 1963, earning $57 million in the United States and Canada. It is one of the highest grossing films of the decade at a worldwide level. And however, the film initially lost money because of the production and marketing costs. And if that film had failed to complete production, if it had stalled out in production, which it did, almost did multiple times, 20th Century Fox would not be around today. It would almost certainly have collapsed. So we're talking about a film, a single film. It was powerful enough to bring down one of the great powerhouses of the entertainment industry. And I think it behooves us to learn something about the journey of this particular project. So tell me when this sounds like a good idea. In September of 1959, Elizabeth Taylor asked for a record-setting $1 million plus 10% of the box office gross and on a blank contract. So 20th Century Fox had been in dire financial straits or difficult financial straits. They needed a blockbuster to put them back on the map, a big success. Cleopatra seems like a great project, great story, just a classic story. And casting her as the lead, she's certainly the it girl in Hollywood at the time. There's no reason not to put her in the most famous film. If you've watched the film, she played the part really well. You totally believe that woman was Cleopatra. So you're taking the it girl, placing her in a huge project, a very important classical, should ought to be a success project. And the studio's in dire financial straits, so they're willing to do almost anything to make it work. She asked for $1 million plus 10% of the box office gross. Now that is a huge amount of money because she gets the box office gross off the top. So she got, if they got $57 million, she got $5.7 million before anybody else got money, in theory. And the contract that they gave her for signing on board this particular project was blank. There were no details on the project at all. She agreed to be in it, and they agreed to cast her, and they specified that this is how much she would get paid without specifying exactly what she had to do. Now, a few months later, that was September of 59. What is it, 9 months later or something like that? Taylor sat down and signed a real contract that's provided a certain number of additional stipulations. One, the film's going to be shot in Europe. And they said that they were going to use the Todd AO format, which was developed by Michael Todd, who was Elizabeth Taylor's late husband. And that would ensure that Taylor was going to make even more money. So if you get the idea that maybe Elizabeth Taylor did okay out of this film, that if there's winners and losers in this project, she's probably a winner, you have that right. Now, Elizabeth Taylor was considered absolutely necessary to the film. And what was it, because she couldn't be replaced, and she was at the time somewhat compromised. She did have poor health, and she also had certain significant addiction to alcohol and perhaps other things as well. When she did not get her way or get what she thought she needed, or when she got sick, production stopped. Now, it's important to understand that in this particular project, producers set up a co-production deal with Italy. And then if you look into the details, the Italian production company started going around talking about how they were going to basically be shooting Cleopatra. It irritated people. So they moved the production to Pinewood Studios in the UK. But they had people shooting with huge crews in the UK and in Italy and in Egypt. So this was a huge project that was being shot across multiple countries, in fact, multiple continents, really. The actual production started in September of 1960, and Taylor got ill multiple times. She was truly ill. She was very, very sick. The script was also constantly in flux. So 20th Century Fox, when they got her to sign this piece of paper saying, hey, I want you to be in this film called Cleopatra, they had no screenplay. So in addition to no contract, they had no screenplay. They had no final screenplay that they wanted to shoot. Then, which makes it a bit difficult, especially when you have three teams with huge crews working in 3 different countries. And there's actually a documentary that dives deep on these details. It's really quite spectacular. So at some point, they realized early in 1961, and they've shot like 10 minutes of film altogether. So they've got 10 minutes of this thing called Cleopatra, and they have already blown through the budget they planned to spend. And there is a conflict between Taylor and the director. So the director has to get replaced, and Taylor gets to pick who the replacement is. Now, they end up firing the first director, and they replace him with a director, Joseph Mankiewicz. And Mankiewicz came along with a screenplay for the film. So that's handy, right? So we're in this thing. We've already spent all of our budget. We finally get a director who's previously worked successfully with Taylor recently and has gotten a film out the door. And this guy actually does have a script in his hot little hands, and Taylor will accept him. So they say, finally, things are starting to look good. And they say, okay, we start to move forward. Despite all of that, it is still January 22nd of 1962 before Rex Harrison and Taylor are finally on the same set. So they can actually do, I don't know, the core of the film. Like, most of the film is actually about those two people. And they finally put them together this far into the production. By the time production wrapped in 1963, there were 120 miles of footage to edit into a film. And remember, this was actually shot on actual celluloid film. So all of that film had to actually be developed. So that was an expense of itself. It had to be kept track of. We had to make sure that it wasn't damaged, right? Because it's like a huge handling problem just to manage that much film. They got together and they did a rough cut. And the rough cut was 5 hours and 20 minutes long. Everybody liked Elizabeth Taylor, but there's no one, and they would sit through a 3-hour film, but the chance of anybody sitting through a 5-hour film was very low. There was Fanny and Alexander sometime in the 80s, but 5-hour films were not going to sell. So it had to actually be cut down. So as they were going through the rough cut, they realized they needed actually more footage. So they had to go and get 1,500 extras back. And I think they did in Italy. I'm not sure, but I think it was in Italy. They got 1,500 extras back, and they did reshoots. And Burton was recalled to London to do reshoots, because notice they're not bringing back Elizabeth. And they fired Mankiewicz. So you can see how well things are going. They actually fired the guy that rescued them in the first place. And then they hired him again to finish the film, right? So that's how well things were going for this particular project. I want to mention that while all of this stuff was going on actually on set and in production, back in Hollywood, Fox actually, before this whole sort of mess started and while this stuff was going on at the very beginning, Fox lost money in 1961. And the specific problem was the production costs for Cleopatra, which were getting radically out of control. And if you think about it, they were supported by investors. So the investors, at any point, the investors can say, actually, we're not going to fund any more of this. This is crazy. We're not giving you no more money. So they could have brought, it was really the investors that hung in there and said, maybe there'll be a film someday, and kept pumping money into these guys and whatever creditors were willing to give them money. Now, Goris, who I believe was president of 20th century, said, look, I'll take drastic measures. I'll do anything I can to make it so that we can keep this company afloat until Cleopatra comes in, and hopefully it works out for us all. He started cutting costs. And one of the projects that he cut was Marilyn Monroe, who was the other it girl at the time. And she cut her project. Now, if you think about it, what that means is the studio was even more dependent on the success of Cleopatra. They really had all of their eggs in one basket, because they started cutting off any other project that might interfere with them being able to have enough money to produce Cleopatra. They'd become insanely reliant on just that one particular project. In 1962, you'll notice that the film wasn't released until 1963. Skouras resigned, and Zanuck became the new president of Fox, and Skouras became the new chairman of the board. So these two guys are trying desperately to keep this company afloat. They finally, fortunately for them, managed to get some kind of a film put together, and Cleopatra was released. Now, it was the biggest box office success of 1963. It earned $58 million, something like that, adjusted for inflation, about $484 million. But it was actually, in real life, it had lost money until Fox sold the TV rights in 1966. Until then, it was a loss. It didn't break even until 1966. When I say break even, that means it didn't make a profit, right? Until 1966. That's like when it started being actually a good investment. And if you have any background investment, what you know is that when getting paid back, when you put money into a project and you get paid back, that doesn't make it a good investment. You actually have to make a profit. You have to actually make extra money in order to make a profit. And so this was a debacle from every perspective. And Hollywood learned a lot from this particular experience. But later on, you'll find out that not everyone learned the lesson. And here's a couple of things just to notice. So the studio who were producing the project, basically they needed a big win. So they took a high stakes gamble. So if you're a producer and you find yourself in a position where you're going to produce a project and it requires you to bet the house, really, it's going to put you out of business if you don't produce the project. That's a pretty big warning sign, right? Especially, this is 20th Century Fox. If they've gone out of business, all these people could go get other jobs. But if you're a little producer and you're putting together a project and you realize you're taking the kind of risk that's going to cost you your home, it's time to think twice. It's because that is called gambling. That is not called business. Notice that they didn't have a finished screenplay. It's not good to start production without a finished screenplay. It's actually not even good to have talent sign contracts, like actors and so forth, if you don't have a screenplay. It's good to have a screenplay. But these people did not have a screenplay. And in fact, they didn't have a screenplay for a long time. When you have an irreplaceable, high value, highly publicized lead who is also very physically fragile, an alcoholic and a drug addict, this spells big trouble. Even just having irreplaceable talent is a problem. Even if she'd been in the best of health, but she had just been in a position to mess with the project because she didn't like how things were going or because she was worried about how the project would sell later, that would have been a problem. The fact that she had these other disabilities was a huge trauma. And that is one of the reasons why you see people, when stars run into trouble, you start seeing the producers asking them to do drug testing on set. You see them requiring them to go to the doctor to be declared physically fit. They do these things to make sure that the project that's depending upon them can survive, because you can't just replace Cleopatra in the middle of a movie. She's got to finish. And the worst possible case scenario is that the film doesn't get finished. That's a dead weight loss. You can't do something with half a film. You can get a bad film. You can produce a film and it could be bad, but you could still sell it, especially it's got her in it. At least people will watch the train wreck because it's got, Elizabeth Taylor in it. People will watch that. But what if you don't even have that? What if you don't even have anything finished that you can sell? That's the worst possible case scenario. So that's why you see in smart producers who are working with lead talent, they do require them to go to the doctor to get declared physically fit. And if they've got any problem with drugs or alcohol, they will make them go through the procedure of doing drug tests and so forth. Um, the other thing is the studio was in complete turmoil. So even before this whole project started, they weren't all that strong or they weren't running their ship very well up until then. And producing this project under these terms was just more of the same. Now, the studio can't really pull the plug on the project because the costs are already sunk. They really have no solution but for this thing to work. And they started sacrificing other projects to pay for it. So Cleopatra taught Hollywood a huge number of lessons. Start with a finished script, make sure talent is healthy and sane, aim for a quick shoot, monitor carefully early on. Like the earliest days of a production are when you want to make sure things are going smoothly, because if you don't cut that stuff off early, you can blow a whole lot of your budget and not get anything for it. Do publicity when success is assured, right? So don't start talking about having high value people attached if you don't know for a fact that they're attached, or you don't know for a fact that the film's going well. If you don't do these things, be prepared to go on a really wild ride that may result in not having a sellable film. So those are some of the intriguing lessons that we learned from Cleopatra. Now, let's talk about another Hollywood favorite. It's a film called Waterworld. Did you ever try to watch Waterworld? It's got so much water. So much water. Just to give some of the backstory on Waterworld. By all accounts, Waterworld was a Mad Max knockoff. Mad Max had done incredibly well. And even back then, there were people who were aware of the idea that climate change was occurring, that the ice caps would melt. And if all the ice caps melt, cities will be entirely submerged. And this is a fundamental premise of Waterworld. And as a matter of fact, it's also in AI and a whole bunch of other films. It's in the zeitgeist that we live in. The initial script, the very first script for Waterworld was written in 1986. And after several rewrites, Kevin Costner and Kevin Reynolds, so Kevin Costner, leading actor, Kevin Reynolds, and a director who'd worked with him very successfully in the past, joined the Waterworld production team. Kevin Costner came on as lead talent, and he also came on as a major investor. And it's 1992. They've worked together on several projects. Who knew? It should go well, right? The script was had been written, and it was co-written by David Bowie. And later it was amended by Kevin Costner with help from Joss Whedon during production. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Now, the key thing is that because Kevin Costner was the lead talent, so already it's like Cleopatra, he's irreplaceable, cannot be replaced. He is also a major investor in the project. And he is he's not just looking at people and saying, hey, the script is broken, here are my notes, go fix it. He is actively working to fix it as well. And he's actually doing this during production. We're going to talk about production in a second, but while production is happening on this ridiculously complicated shoot, which we will go into great detail in just a moment, he is actually also working on the screenplay. And at one point, he summoned Joss Whedon out to help him work on the screenplay. And when you get a chance, look up what Joss Whedon had to say about working with Waterworld. He did not enjoy his time working on that particular project. In fact, things got to be so bad that director Kevin Reynolds quit the film before its release, owing specifically to heated battles with Costner over his creative directions or decisions. Because again, Kevin Costner was in the driver's seat. Universal budgeted $100 million to start, which was a lot of money at that time. It was heavy duty, what we would consider to be like Marvel money, right? Like that size of film. They upped it to $135 million, then $175 million. And eventually they got all the way up to $235 million when you take into account production, marketing, and distribution. And the box office for the film when it was released was 264 million, about half of which distributors keep. So just a quick reminder. In those days, it's less so these days, but in those days particularly, when you produced a film and you gave it to the distributors, to the theaters, right? The theaters would take the ticket sale money, but they would keep about half of it. So you can have a great release, but if your film doesn't make 3 times what it costs to produce, you're not going to get back enough money to say you made a profit. If you get back twice as much and the distributor takes half and you get the other half, well, maybe you could say you broke even. But to actually make a profit, you have to at least make 3 times. So they would have had to make, $7 million, $700 million or something to make a profit. And they only made 264 million. So it was not good. It was a very bad situation. Now, we talked a little bit about production before and the fact that Kevin Costner was working on the screenplay while being the solo actor for most of the film and simultaneously also being the investor for the project. Filming took place in a large artificial seawater enclosure in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of Hawaii. And it also took place in Los Angeles and Huntington Beach and Santa Catalina Island and the Channel Islands of California. Now, before filming began, Steven Spielberg, obviously he knows these people, he says, look, I am warning you, I did Jaws and I filmed on open water. And I am telling you, do not film this project on open water. And for several reasons. If you think about Jaws, there's the end of the film. Let's call it the last quarter. Is out on the boat, and the boat's sinking, and the sharks attacking, etc. And it's a small boat, just a single boat. Everybody's on the boat, and the shark is attacking the boat, which is not Waterworld, because Waterworld, there's crazy things going on. There's like a whole little city he has to sail into, etc., etc., etc. It's the most complicated sea film you can conceivably imagine. And they had to build a huge set. So in addition to the fact that they got Kevin Costner out there and he's writing the screenplay and he's a major investor and that requires him to basically drive a boat as like a custom, they actually created specialized equipment for this particular thing. He had a boat that had, first of all, they had a whole bunch of boats and they had a whole bunch of customized watercraft. And then in addition to that, he had a boat that had a whole bunch of incredibly advanced features. So this was like, just talk about hard special effects. You have to get people that do specialty boat building, for God's sake. So while they got that thing going on, and then they had to build this huge city that is this vast floating city, basically, that he sails into. They built that. Meanwhile, during production, there were multiple hurricane scares, and they did in fact get hit by a hurricane, which actually destroyed the floating city, severely damaged the floating city, and they had to rebuild it. Oh, and by the way, they almost accidentally killed Kevin Costner in this whole thing as well. So Waterworld has, for years, when you want to talk about a film that's just totally gone off the rails, you say Waterworld. And if you talk to people, they will actually say, it's a pretty good film. But you can watch it and you go, wow, this is pretty apocalyptic and maybe pretty far-seeing. It's a little like Cleopatra. It's a ride. It's intense. But the point is that it was very toxic to a lot of the people that were involved in the particular project. And I want to mention in passing, it wasn't just Kevin Costner alone out there. He had a whole crew and a whole production team that were also out there as well. So he wasn't the only one who couldn't go home. Everybody that was working on the project, you said yes, and then you were just involved in this thing that went on and became more and more difficult over time. The lessons that we should take away from this are, once again, there was no finished script before production. Really, if you're producing a project, the smartest thing you can possibly do is just nail down your screenplay and actually get on paper a screenplay that you agree to, that everybody working on the project agrees to, that everybody likes, and nobody says, we'll change the script later. No changing the screenplay later. because once people agree to the screenplay, if one guy makes a change, other people are going to want to make a change, and things just go to hell in a handbasket very quickly. The second thing is, this thing too was produced in multiple locations. It wasn't like you just went to a place. No, you went to multiple places. More importantly, you went to multiple places on water. And some of those places were getting hit by hurricanes. It's dangerous to you. It's dangerous to your casting crew. It's expensive. If you're building anything, it's obviously gonna chance of it sinking or being destroyed is incredibly high. It's just incredibly try not to give yourself those kinds of technical problems. There's no reason for it. Find something easier to produce or wait till the time where you have enough control. That if you want to, people have produced projects on the water that went relatively smoothly, like Jaws. They got that thing out the door. And there have been other films where it's just two people in the water waiting to get eaten by sharks. And that works out. But this kind of production where there's a huge amount of sets and a huge amount of equipment and you've got major stars and it's shooting for a long time and there's no screenplay, it's just going to guarantee be a disaster. The lead talent could not be replaced. And once the film was underway, the project was too expensive to cancel. And Kevin Costner, you couldn't say no to him because he was the lead talent and he was also a major investor. They spent $20 million creating customized equipment and an expensive man-made island. Now think about that. Right now, when you want to go buy a house, you're thinking, I want to go buy a house. And you might say, if you're splurging, you go, I'm going to spend $2 million on that house, or I'm going to spend $1 million on that house. That's a lot of house. These people spent $20 million on a man-made island that got destroyed. And I don't think anybody actually ever lived in that $20 million set. That's a lot of money to spend on something that's just going to go away. And also, when you spend that much money on a floating island, and it has to be safe enough for actors to actually work on and camera crew to shoot on, you're talking about quite a liability. Now, when you get a chance and you actually have the stuff that gets sent out to you, the workbook, go check out The Mummy with Tom Cruise because it had a lot of the same challenges. Now, The Mummy's been made multiple times, but The Mummy with Tom Cruise specifically, if you go take a look at it, you'll see it had a lot of the same issues. Once again, he was a major financial partner. He was lead talent. The script wasn't nailed down, and the script was constantly in development while they were shooting the project. I'm sure you see a pattern. Now, let's go talk about another project everybody knows about, and let's talk about some very specific details. Twilight Zone, the movie, was being shot in 1982. Steven Spielberg was working on it, and he was working with a director that he worked with routinely on a regular basis named John Landis. Now, to say that this created a problem between them is an understatement. During the making of The Twilight Zone, John Landis was not in the mood when they were shooting this particular film to take outside advice or insight or suggestions from anyone, by all accounts. So it is said in the documentation that I've read, and I'm sure you can look up, when you get a chance, you can go Google it for yourself. Reports were and statements were made to the court that indicated that he had been warned that he was making a series of decisions that were not going to work out well for all involved. So fundamentally what happened is it's the middle of the night. They're here in Southern California. They're making the Twilight Zone. They have a helicopter over a riverbed, and then they have pyrotechnics going off that are blowing up, and they're blowing up near the helicopter. And they had Vic Morrow, the actor Vic Morrow, and he had two children, Micah and Renee, and they were on the ground and went out like a rice paddy because the story was basically set, I think, in something in Vietnam. And there was a helicopter suspended above them, and one of the explosions, that was one of the pyrotechnical explosions, went off and tipped the helicopter. It was too close to one of the rotors, and it caused the rear, I believe it was the rear rotor, came off. And turns out those rear rotors on those helicopters go really fast. Destabilized the helicopter. It fell down, and both of those things impacted the Vic Moreau, decapitating Moreau and one of the children, and then the other kid got crushed by the helicopter. And then people were injured inside the helicopter as well. And this particular incident led to years of civil and criminal action against the personnel that were overseeing the shoot, including the director, John Landis. And it was responsible for the introduction of a whole bunch of new procedures and safety standards in the filmmaking industry, which to this day, to my shock, I have heard people have come up and told me things they're doing that are totally in violation of this. So one would think people had learned their lesson, but apparently not. So here's some interesting things about that particular shoot. One, both the children had been hired without permits. Their parents had been paid under the table. They were illegally working at night, and they were working around explosives. All of those things are incredibly wrong. All of them. The helicopter was 25 feet from the ground. So think about, if you see 25 feet, you figure that you're 6 feet tall, right? So if you stood on your own head, if you think about it, that's 3 people tall, right? It's a 2-story building, 2.5-story building, 25 feet. It's very close to the ground, right? These kids. And simultaneously, in addition to being next to this actor and these 2 kids, are they not next to a large explosive mortar effect? And I don't know if you know what a mortar is. Mortar is a lot like a bomb. It's like a firework, only instead of shooting into the sky and blowing up, it shoots, the fire comes out the end and pushes off and then hurls something in a particular direction. So it's like a cannon in a way. So this explosion happens, and the rotor detaches from the tail, and the low-flying helicopter spins out of control. And as I said, Morrow and Lee were decapitated and by the rotor blades, because again, it's only 25 feet above the ground. And Chen was crushed to death by the helicopter's right landing skid. Do your own research. This is what my research indicates, but you should definitely confirm these details. But I'm sure that there's many transcripts of the court cases lying around. Now, what's interesting is that Landis had earlier shrugged off warnings about the stunt with the comment, "We may lose the helicopter." Members of his crew said he didn't have time for suggestions from anybody about anything, and it was the first time, this particular project was the first time a director was ever charged due to a fatality on set. Filmmaker Steven Spielberg, who co-produced the Twilight Zone movie with Landis, broke off their friendship following the accident. He said, "No movie is worth dying for. I think people are standing up to much more now than ever before to producers and directors who ask too much. If something isn't safe, it is the right and responsibility of every actor or crew member to yell cut." So what's interesting is I don't know about you, but I'm in the entertainment industry. People always talk about shooting guerrilla style, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's what this guy was doing. He was shooting guerrilla style with a helicopter. But I've seen people talk about having people in the back of a truck with the doors open while they're driving and they're filming. I've heard about people hiring children illegally. I've heard about people doing stunts without authorization. And every single one of those people needs to understand about the Twilight Zone story, because that ended up to be career destroying, and it ended up killing people. And the reason that the rules that govern production matter so much is because people can die, right? And it's stupid how people can die. People can die just because they have a ladder and it's inappropriately set up, and because nobody feels like setting it up correctly, or people decide to put cables on the floor and then water gets on the floor and all of a sudden it's a place where people can get electrocuted. Rules are rules and they matter. So when you're shooting a production, you need to understand that you're responsible for the health and welfare and safety of every single person on that set. And the reason that you obey the rules is because you don't want to go to jail or get sued, not just for the income you currently have, but for everything that you own or could own in the future. So the Twilight Zone story is a good reminder of that. It's also a good reminder for people that are working on a set where they see that stuff start to happen, that they're allowed to say, "Cut. I'm not going to shoot under these conditions." If everybody says, "Cut, I'm not going to shoot under these conditions," then the project stops and safety is maintained. So you have that right when you're working on an unsafe set. One of the cool things about being a SAG member is that you have the ability to have SAG actually come to the set and say it's unsafe. Any SAG member can call SAG and say, "This is an unsafe set." And SAG will come help you shut them down. Now, let's talk about a film called Midnight Rider. And this one is slightly less famous. I wish we heard about it more. So Midnight Rider is a film based on the Greg Allman story, based on the autobiography My Cross to Bear by the singer Greg Allman. And Miller and Savin were the producer for this particular project. Now, I want to mention in passing that this is another one of those projects where the script wasn't finished. It doesn't really matter, as we're going to find, because they didn't get too far shooting the darn thing. But I do want to mention there was not a finished script, which is starting to, for me, is starting to turn out to the thing. If I see somebody go into production and the script's not finished, I think you're just slow. Why would you not just get, that's saying I'm going to start construction on this house, but I don't have a blueprint. So, but anyway, so this horrific situation happened on the first actual day of filming. On February 20th, 2014, the first day of filming, the crew was on an active railroad bridge over the Tillamook River in Wayne County, Georgia. Now, I want to, so they were on a bridge that went over a river. So they couldn't just get off the bridge, right? They couldn't just step off the bridge. It wasn't like when you tie a girl to the train tracks and you could just walk away from the girl, she'll get killed, but you'll live because you're nowhere near the stupid train. These people were on the track, and the track was over water, and it was high. So now these crazy people had decided to take a metal frame bed. Under the Miller's direction, the crew was going to film a dream sequence, and they was involving William Hurt. So first day of production, William Hurt is on this stupid heavy metal hospital bed, or that's on the bed. William Hurt's there. And they're on this bridge over the water, high above the river. And while they were filming, a train came around the corner at 58 miles an hour, giving the cast and crew less than 1 minute to evacuate the filming location. And in order to evacuate, they had to run toward the train because that was the closest way off this stupid bridge. And some of the cast and crew tried to actually save the camera equipment because, damn, we're troopers. And I tried to get the crane off the track, the bed off the tracks, because they didn't want it to hurt the train and didn't want it to hurt. The collision was not going to be good for anybody that was nearby. So they tried to clear the track. And they had less than a minute to do all of this crap. The only escape route was for the oncoming train. And the train ended up hitting and shattering the metal bed, sending shrapnel everywhere. Now, due to this criminal so meanwhile, the crew had asked, look, are you sure it's okay to shoot on this track? Because it was a live train track. Freight went over this stupid thing routinely. And they had said, is this a safe train track? Is it shut down? And in fact, the people running the project said, yes, the train, it's shut down. They lied to them and they said, yes, it's fine. It's totally cool to shoot at this particular point. We've cleared it with the train company. It should be fine. No problem. No problem. Everything should be exactly safe as can be. Don't worry about it. And interestingly enough, the production company had contracted routinely the train folks and said, hey, can we shoot? And they said no. And they just decided to do it anyway. So they just, the production team, not the production team, but the leaders of the production, producers of the production basically said, yeah, we're just going to go ahead. We're going to do this anyway. So they must have been brain dead. Now, so this woman, this poor camerawoman, was totally killed for no good reason. Miller, Savin, the EP, Jay Sedrish, First AD, Hillary Schwartz, were all charged with involuntary manslaughter and criminal trespass, and they were also cited by OSHA for serious and willful safety violations. On March 9th, Miller pled guilty to felony involuntary manslaughter and criminal trespassing and received a 10-year sentence, of which he only served 1 year, because apparently that's okay there, and it was followed by probation. Cedric was also convicted of felony involving manslaughter and criminal trespassing via a plea bargain and sentenced to 10 years of probation. The charges against Savin were dropped as part of a plea agreement with her husband and business partner, Randall Miller. Now, it's not enough. It's important to understand that when these kinds of things go wrong, it is not just the criminal prosecution, which is bad enough. It's not it's not a trivial thing to actually be convicted of a felony. It's a hugely difficult thing. You don't just lose your right to vote. You have to tell people, you have to tell investors, it's one of the kinds of things that you have to disclose. You have to, lenders, like people that are going to hire you, people, if you're a producer and you want to be able to get insurance in the future for your particular productions. I mean, it's a big deal to be convicted criminally of a felony. for something horrifying like this. So it's career damaging and life damaging, destroying at the very least. But in addition to that, what comes after is the civil lawsuits. So in July 2017, a jury awarded the Joneses, Sarah Jones family, $11.2 million, of which $3.14 million came from Miller, and Chavin, Schwartz, and Sertish also had financial obligations as well. So when you're cutting corners on a particular project, or you're on a project where corners are being cut like this, you're looking at life-changing activities. You're looking at a situation where you could be killed, or if you're the one telling people to do this stupid thing, you're the one who could be facing criminal charges and who could also be convicted, looking forward to civil costs as well. Midnight Riders had a huge impact on the entertainment industry because previously it was one of the first times where you actually had a producer get convicted of something that looked a hell of a lot like murder. Manslaughter is a very serious charge, and being convicted of is a very serious thing. And it indicated that if you're in the entertainment industry, you have to be very careful at protecting your cast and your crew because the penalties are going up dramatically. It could have been from the 1930s, maybe you could kill a few people on your set, but you're not going to be doing that here in the new millennia. Now, let's move on to something that's a little bit more pleasant and a little weirder. So I think for a lot of people, first of all, The Godfather is definitely one of my favorite films. I think it is a masterpiece. And I think that for a wide variety of reasons, and I think a lot of people agree with me. If you look at everybody's top 100 films, you're going to see The Godfather in that list. And if you look at almost everybody's top 10 list, you're going to find The Godfather on probably the majority of them. Now, The Godfather was based on Mario Puzo's book, The Godfather, and the project was going to be produced by Alan S. Ruddy at Paramount Pictures for distribution by Paramount. Now, what's important to understand is that Albert S. Ruddy was hired as a producer in large part because he was known for bringing his films in under budget. Paramount was in a situation like 20th Century had been previously, where they were having trouble keeping their company profitable. The company had been plagued by cost overruns on many projects, and they had set arbitrarily the budget for this particular film to $2.5 million. Now, I want to mention that The Godfather, Mario Puzo's book, was insanely popular. And the fact that Paramount got the film was because they put their bid in early, right? So they bought the rights very early when Mario Puzo was very much out of money. And they were just incredibly fortunate to get this thing. It was guaranteed to be a blockbuster if it was made well. And it was a great film. If you read the Mario Puzo book, it is, and this in the nicest possible way, because I write Pulp Fiction. It was a very Pulp Fiction book. It had a lot of sex. It had a lot of violence. And Mario Puzo actually had talked to quite a number of people that work in organized crime, especially Italian organized crime, or Italian, you can't really call it Italian organized crime, but let's say the Cosa Nostra. You talk to a lot of interesting people. So it had a lot of verisimilitude. So the idea that they were going to set the price for this particular project at $2.5 million was bizarre, since it was such an incredibly hot property, very valuable property. As the got more popular, they increased the budget all the way up to $6 million. And actually that was a large part because Coppola actually repeatedly begged them, come on, so give me a little more money. Let's make this actually a good film, because why not? And there were champions for the project at the studio. So they got a little bit more money. But compared to the value of the property, it's shocking that they didn't get more. Probably for the best in some ways. But now Francis Ford Coppola, the people that were producing the film at Paramount desperately wanted to have it be an Italian film. There'd been a previous mafia film that had been produced, and it had not all these people that were not Italian at all. So it was like, it didn't seem like it was about the mafia. It seemed about something completely different. So the commitment at this time was try to really bring in the Italian American flavor of Mario Puzo's book. And so they brought in a director of Italian ancestry. It was Francis Ford Coppola. And they brought him in specifically because he would work for a low amount of money. and he would work on a low budget project, and he was strapped, or actually significantly strapped, due to the reception of the last film he'd done, which was The Rain People. Now, Coppola's studio, American Zoetrope, owed over $400,000 to Warner Brothers for budget overruns with the film THX 1138, which was a very strange science fiction film. He took the job, and he took it. So just keep this in mind. Think about The Godfather. Coppola took that project for $125,000 and 6% of the gross rentals. So not gross for the whole project, but just the gross rentals for the project. Now, I mentioned in passing that Coppola had initially turned down the job because he thought the novel was pretty cheap stuff. If you read it, it's an exploitation. It's very exploitative kind of book. Stop me when you've heard this before. There was no finished screenplay at the beginning of the project. So Puzo and Coppola ended up rewriting the screenplay from opposite coasts. And so Coppola signs on. He goes, okay, so where's the screenplay for this thing? And they send it over to him. He goes, well, this is crap. And he and the book author work together and try to put together a screenplay they both like. And they end up getting, if the original screenplay was 100 pages, they end up with 140 pages. So things aren't really going the right direction, but maybe there are 140 better pages. I suspect they must have been. The other thing was that in addition to having to accommodate Puzo's requirement, and because he's the book owner, he had some, and Coppola's requirements, because he has to shoot the film, Ruddy and other people gave them notes. And one of the notes they got was the version that they produced was not violent enough. So there's a scene in there where Carlo, ends up beating his wife, the one where he chases her through the house, they put that in because they wanted to showcase put more violence in this particular project. Now, initially, Paramount wanted to film this thing in Kansas, but just take a moment to imagine The Godfather filmed in Kansas. And I think they also want to do a lot of it on studio sets. So let's just momentarily think about that. That would be a crap film. But Coppola begged and begged and begged, and finally they let him film it in New York City and in Sicily. Paramount wanted a contemporary piece because they wanted to cut costs. But Coppola successfully argued, after much arguing, that they had to set it back into the 40s and 50s. So they basically took it from being a modern film or contemporary film at the time to being a film set in just after the war, because Michael Corleone, it's kind of key to the story that Michael Corleone has just returned from war, and he is in fact a war hero. Coppola moved the film back to that time period. Now, it was an incredibly contentious set. Ruddy had a lot of control. He had very strong notions about the project, did not agree with almost every creative decision that Coppola made. And he had people on the set who did not like Francis Ford Coppola and were actively working to get him fired 100% of the time, all the time. And Coppola, in response, said, like The Godfather, I started firing people as a preemptory strike. The people who were angling the most to have me fired, I had fired. Paramount hated that. When you get a chance, it's go back, and there's a number of books that have been written about the production of The Godfather. And it's interesting to read how much Paramount hated Coppola's casting choices. Did not want Al Pacino, did not want Duvall. Coppola actually cast his own sinner as Connie Corleone, the girl that gets married at the beginning. And every casting decision that he really cared greatly about, they gave him trouble for. Brando, and they didn't really even want Brando at the very beginning, but they got attached to him. They did attach him. Brando threatened to quit if Coppola was fired. So it was Brando stepping in and basically saying, I'm one of the few assets you actually have on this project that's a name. And I'm telling you, if he leaves, I leave. So production was an ongoing battle day by day for a film that most people have on their top 10 list, which turned into a financial blockbuster at the start of a popular trilogy. Now, there's a lot of things we can learn about The Godfather. And I think it's an important thing for people to pay attention to because it's illustrative of what success can feel like in Hollywood. It is truly the poison cup. You can be brilliant and you can be doing great work and you can still endure an incredible amount of hassle and subject yourself to an incredible amount of risk on a particular project. If you bail out or you crash the project or make it a failure, it's going to severely impact your career going forward. Coppola, once he took that project, had to make it succeed. One of the reasons he fought so hard, one of the reasons he did not give up, one of the reasons he went to the wall is he realized if he screwed up this particular book, it was going to be really hard for him to get work after. People were not going to trust him. Now, the other thing is when you're really in a horrible place to negotiate, when you're deeply in debt and you need money and you sign the contract and you can't walk away. That is like a very toxic combination. And one of the reasons when you're in Hollywood and you're talking to people and you're working with people and they say, don't look desperate. The reason you don't want to look desperate when you're in meetings or when you're making pitches is because you're incredibly easy to exploit. It's critical that you not put yourself in a position where people can ask you can basically get you to go to your bottom dollar or get you to agree to anything just because you want to produce your project. It's the kind of thing that leads you to having a very difficult career and puts you in a situation where you might actually lose the little that you do have. The other thing it's worth noting is that having a reputation of doing things on the cheap is a truly double-edged sword career-wise, because it, it can mean that you really have to fight tooth and nail just to get the money required to do the project at all or to do it at all. I think a lot of times we get focused on, I really want to do this particular project and I'll do it for $1.50 if I have to. But if you do a project for next to nothing, is it going to be good enough? Is it going to actually contribute to your career? Is it actually going to, maybe it's a good time to put that project away and do something you really can do well on a lower budget. And maybe don't get yourself a reputation. When people ask how much it costs to produce a project, maybe don't tell them a rock bottom price. And when you're bidding on projects, don't mention a rock bottom price, because the lower price you set, one, they're going to make you stick to it. They may not even give you that amount of money. And if you fail to perform, it's still your career on the line. Now, occasionally, a really great film will come out of ongoing bitter conflict. Great bands that produce amazing music when they loathe each other. The Police at the end, for example. But because every single decision has to be fought for and argued for. And eventually, maybe you end up getting to something that most people like because every decision has been considered and considered and considered and considered again. So sometimes that works out. It's very painful for the people that are involved, and it's very stressful for the people that are involved, and it's very stressful for their families as well. Sometimes, if you're in exactly the right position, the hassle pays off very well financially. So and I want to specifically note that getting a percentage of gross on a project is much better than getting a percentage of net. When gross means that you get a percentage off the money that comes in, net means the money comes in and then costs are subtracted and you get a percentage of what's left over. If you're negotiating a contract, negotiate for gross. It makes the accounting much easier and it's much harder to hide money. It's just a much better thing. Now, sometimes horrific experiences on production lead to new opportunities to both succeed and to fail. Now, I mentioned The Godfather specifically because I think if you would have asked Coppola, and many times during that production, do you wish you could go back in time and say, I do not want to work on this production? He would have said yes. And not every project that goes like The Godfather did comes out well. You need to be aware when you're making that kind of deal with the devil that you're really up for the drama that you're getting yourself involved in. Because the older you get and the more you have to lose, the more dangerous it is. Now, I just want to talk for a few minutes about All the President's Men, which is another successful film, but it has some interesting ramifications, and I think it's particularly relevant for writers. All the President's Men, 1976 film about the Washington Post investigation that brought Nixon down. And it's based on the book by two writers for the Washington Post named Woodward and Bernstein. So, Robert Redford bought the film rights to the book because obviously very politically active. It was really a very good book. It was about a very important time in history. Redford obviously had an interest in doing the particular project, and he worked very successfully previously with Goldman. What could go wrong? Now, so Robert Redford gets the film rights and he hires Goldman to write the project. Now, I want to mention that Goldman, who is literally the world's leading screenwriter at this time, like, he was the best screenwriter in Hollywood by every account. There's nobody who thought that guy was a hack. He had to work with two other incredibly strong writers, the Washington Post writers, and he was talking about a story that they actually lived. So they were pretty passionate about the project. And they've written a book about it. That's how passionate they were. And he has to meanwhile turn this into a script that actually people are going to watch, because no one's going to watch the book as it is written, right? So in working with the two writers, he found Woodward helpful and Bernstein not. And he has to come up with a screenplay. And I want to mention that in addition to Woodward and Bernstein, he has to work with Redford, who obviously, having purchased the project, has very strong feelings about the script as well. So he's the leading screenwriter in the world. He's got a hell of a lot more help than he needs on this particular project. He's dealing with a constant influx of input and criticism from people who have never written a single award-winning play in their whole life. And he finally comes up with a draft. And his draft of the screenplay, his first draft of the screenplay, is presented to Warner Brothers, and they say, hey, looks good. Let's finance the film. Now, the interesting thing is that Redford didn't like the draft. Neither did Woodward, and neither did Bernstein. So Bernstein, who had not been particularly helpful previously, worked with Nora Ephron to come up with a new draft. And meanwhile, simultaneously, Alan Pakula and Redford also spent weeks editing the screenplay. Like, again, one of the best screenwriters in the world, who produced the screenplays all time, was very good at it and had a lot of success with the screenplays. All of a sudden, it's got all of this input from all these other people telling him how to write a screenplay. And one of the most annoying parts of this whole thing, and it is a kind of an interesting thing, and if you actually take a look at the screenplay for the project, or you watch the film, you'll notice that All the President Men stops before Nixon is convicted and before he's thrown out of office. It ends the night that he gets reelected. And the reason is because over the course of the film, the big issue is just to get people to believe. They have to figure out what's going on. The reporters had to figure out what's going on. They have to get the paper to release the information, and they have to have the trail that they need in order to convince the whole world that Nixon needs to be impeached and needs to be removed from office. And that's what is achieved on the night Nixon is being reelected. So he cuts off like the last half of the book. Anyway, long and short of it is, Redford later came out and said, years later, and I think that was truly an amazing screenplay. It was very well written. Later, Redford came out and claimed that Goldman should not have been awarded the Oscar for the best adapted screenplay because he didn't write the screenplay for the film. And Richard Staten, who was writing for Written by Magazine, did an investigation and compared the competing scripts, the one that was shot and the one that Goldman submitted. And he said, Goldman wrote this screenplay. What Goldman created was the film that ended up on screen. So that was, if you go and you read Goldman's biography, you'll see that he talks about all of the projects that he did. Many of them obviously had drama because he was working at the highest levels of Hollywood. And he said the one project he would never do again was All the President's Men. Like he wished he had not done it. And that's the one that he got an award. So the moral of this story is you can really be doing your best work on a film that makes almost everyone's best movie list, and you can still have to endure a great deal of hassle and misery, even from people you consider very close friends. And people can discredit you or take credit for your work, and there's really not much recourse. There's not much anything. What can Goldman do except say it's not true what you said, and I'm insulted that you said it. Now, it's possible for you to profit on such projects, but you have to make sure that you're being well paid, because the cost of working with you gives you some level of control for how many hours you work. So if you're a writer, when you negotiate a deal to write a screenplay for somebody, you have the capacity to say the first draft costs $100,000 or 50,000 and the second draft costs this much, and I only have to give you 2 drafts. Or maybe I'll give you 3 drafts. First draft, a second draft with your edits, and a third draft with your final edit. And then after that, you have to go get yourself a new writer. If you are getting paid enough and you've got your contracts in place, then you're making enough money to be able to handle doing all of those edits. And there's a limit. You can say, look, I'm not doing anything more than the contract requires. If you don't have a contract, things can get very sticky. Also, in the contract, you specify who is the writer on the project, and you submit the drafts. Usually you'll submit them through an attorney, so there's proof of what you're submitting and provides a controlled relationship. And if you're going to be writing for money, it's important. That's why it's important for you to have a contract, because otherwise you can truly be taken advantage of. The other thing is there's a reason it's good to be a WGA union member. They do sometimes dive in when there's a dispute about who owns a particular who owns a particular screenplay and when contracts are not being honored. It's just really a good thing to be able to say, my contract says I owe you 2 drafts and I've delivered 2 drafts, so I'm not working anymore on this particular project. Off you go. And being able to say, that's my script, I can tell because I submitted it to you through my attorney pursuant to this particular contract. I think a lot of times people play very fast and loose when it comes to writing for film, and I think you would do well not to do that. Cool. So generally, the lessons that we've learned, I hope this has been useful to you. I actually really enjoy reading about past successful films and very unsuccessful films, specifically because I think it's the best way to learn the truth about the industry as opposed to what one tends to be told. I think we can all agree entering production without a finished screenplay is just stupid. People should not do that. It's important to have a screenplay that all key stakeholders agree is not going to be a hassle. Minor adjustments on set are one thing, rewriting on set is another. Like rewriting it during actual production is disastrous. Too many writers on a project is really a bad sign. If you've got 15 different writers writing on a project, things are going to get ugly. It means that there's not a consensus on the film that everyone wants to make, right? You see too many writers working on a project, people start rushing in, or somebody starts coming up with new drafts, or they start bringing extra writers on board. It means that there's not a consensus about the film that the whole team wants to make. And that kind of fracture can make it so you spend a hell of a lot of money not producing anything. If you're too reliant on name talent to be able to replace people, and when those people particularly are not bought into the script that is on the table that theoretically we're producing, that is a huge problem because they can hold your production hostage. They cannot be replaced. When you have on-screen talent, particularly if it's name talent, and if the second that you start shooting them, you're in a position where you're stuck with them because you can't change either, or you're going to have to go reshoot. So you're going to have blown your money and not have anything to show for it. So I think people, a lot of times they're told, get name talent. It's important to get name talent that wants to shoot the project you actually want to shoot. And it's important to make sure that they're sane and cogent and capable of showing up on set, and that you've got a finished screenplay that they've agreed to. And all of these things really matter if you don't want to have a disaster on your hands. As a writer, director, lead talent, when a film goes out, if the bad film goes out and it fails at the box office, the person whose career gets damaged is yours. Whereas the producers have the desire to get something out the door, because if they don't get something out the door, they got nothing to sell. Writers, directors, lead talent, if they put a bad film out, they have a hard time getting work next month or next year. So you need, as a writer or director or lead talent, you need to make sure that the script is exactly what you want to shoot, and that the people that you're working with, the producers that you're working with, have their heads together, and that the project that you're looking at is the project they're actually going to make. If you are one of those people, writer, director, lead talent, and you join Key Crew and you join a project that you know is compromised, like it's got a bad script, or it's got no money, or it's got an incompetent director or a really bad producer, it's pretty much just guaranteeing you're going to work, maybe not get paid, or maybe get paid too little, and you're going to end up damaging your career, and you're going to end up earning less going forward. Good development, the process at the beginning where you get the screenplay, you get the financing, you get the talent, the right talent on board. Good development is key. to getting a great project done. And sometimes a project is great, makes money, and you still wish you'd never gotten involved, but give yourself the best possible chance of success. Now, I'm going to go ahead and stop to see if people have questions, or I'll go ahead and check the Q&A button, chat button, just to see. If you don't know what development is, or you don't know how to build a film project, Zan says they like the idea of turning a Zoom table read into a podcast. When you get a chance, that's actually not a bad way to go. If you go onto the video workshop and look at the last video project, the last video workshop that I posted, dives deep in how to do that. And there's a whole bunch of workshops that cover how to do podcasts. Podcasts are cool. Let's see. And Serena's going to ask a question in a second, but I'm going to go ahead and move through. Let's see. So Chris Hart said, I worked on the latest Mummy. Tom Cruise totally changed the script and the ending. Yeah, and that was something that they talked about, is the fact that, again, because he is an actor producer, he's incredibly wealthy. He has the capacity to dominate any project that he's a part of. Sarita mentions Rust, the Alec Baldwin problem. I think talking about that is dangerous because it seems litigatory, but I think everybody knows it's dangerous to have firearms on set. And again, I've heard people, when they start talking about shooting gorilla and they start having guns on set or having explosives, it's wow, you just don't, you take risks I would never take. Let's see. Yeah, the blind, and she refers to the person who was hit by a train. That was the project I was talking about earlier. It was Midnight Rider. And Sarita's right. You want to have a contract, even with close friends. A contract is, if you want to have close friends after a project is done, have a contract, and everybody honor the contract. The safest way to make sure that you're going to be successful, and successful projects create fewer enemies than unsuccessful projects. And when you have a contract, everybody knows what they're supposed to do. And if you can't even get together to come up with a contract, then what's the hope that you're going to be able to produce a good film? All right. I had a great time talking to you all. Christine, I mentioned that Christine Owens has joined us again. Sherwood Oaks College. Sherwood Oaks Film School. When you get a chance, you should go check it out. If you are producing stuff, send me emails, because I like to hear. If I can be of service to you, or you feel stuck or frustrated, do send me an email as well. Nancy at nancyfultonmeetups.com.
Thanks for listening to the Hollywood Insider Podcast. If you have questions you'd like answered, guests you would like to suggest, or topics you'd like us to cover, please email Nancy at nancyfultonmeetups.com. If you like what you hear, please click to follow the podcast and give us a kind word in the comments. If you find our thoughts and suggestions help you, please share our podcast with other creators who need help. We love being of service to creative minds. This podcast is produced by No Better Friend Entertainment, and this audio recording was copyrighted in 2024. All rights reserved. Music for this episode is licensed for commercial use from pond5.com.